There was certainly an era where movie soundtracks were everything. And they were, like,
Everything.
huge. Welcome to Get to the Hook. I am your co-host, Charles Latibeaudiere.
And I'm your co-host, Eric Colley.
All right, and we are going to jump into this week with a topic that we talk about all the time just because it's a thing in music that I feel like it's not as big as it used to be. There was certainly an era where movie soundtracks were everything, and they were like huge. I mean, you would listen to the top 40 and at least half the songs would be off of soundtracks.
Absolutely.
Not as much of a thing these days, but two movies that have been number one the last 2 weeks might be changing that a little bit.
We got some big soundtracks out right now and two very different kind of soundtracks. We'll talk about like the different kinds of them. One, you have like the soundtrack that's a compilation of proven hits that just are fun in the movie. Deadpool and Wolverine uses a lot of hits.
I call that a cheap trick.
Kind of, although Cheap Trick's not on the soundtrack.
Although Cheap Trick's not on it. No.
Yeah, like there's a lot, like Madonna's Like a Prayer, and there's Iris by Goo Goo Dolls, which is from a different soundtrack in the 90s. That was on City of Angels. But
that's where they're just using songs that work with the character. Like there's a reason why the character would be, that's kind of with it, that's Deadpool's personality, right? So,
and we've seen a lot of movies over the years that do that kind of nostalgia compilation. The Forrest Gump soundtrack back in the day, Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack, Boogie Nights, all those soundtracks were
Big Chill.
Yeah, the Big Chill kind of kicked that off.
Yes.
With like all the 60s hits. The other big movie that has an all original soundtrack, and this is the kind I prefer, Twisters has a soundtrack that is all of the biggest country artists out right now. You've got Jelly Rolls on it, Lainey Wilson, Bailey Zimmerman, and the biggest hit from the movie so far is this song, Luke Combs' Ain't No Love in Oklahoma.
Ain't no love in Oklahoma, just a whistle of a long black train. You'll know when it's coming for you.
I always used to love that when a soundtrack would come out and it'd be a new song by an artist you love and it's not on their album.
Right.
It's like a special.
And you got to go get the soundtrack.
Right.
That's the way it was when we were growing up. That was like how they would put together soundtracks. They would have a movie, and part of the budget of the movie was, all right, we're also going to put together this kick-ass soundtrack and go get me. And they'd have the music director go out and get the best artists possible. Right. They'd have the best songwriters, and they'd lay it all out, a la Footloose.
Yeah. And we will get to Footloose.
Yeah, so we're going to get to it. All right.
So there's kind of an evolution here you see of soundtracks over the years. So early on, it was a lot of like film scores, the instrumental score, or like cast recordings, and then it kind of evolved into like the giant pop mega blockbuster that you and I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
Then Disney basically just owned soundtracks, and they kind of still do. Everyone from Zac Efron to Kendrick Lamar, we got on Disney soundtracks. But we'll go back to the earliest one we're going to do here is from 1961. This is the era of like the big cast recording when musicals were still a big deal.
Right.
And not only is this the longest running number one soundtrack ever, it is the longest running number one album in history. 54 weeks, this was number one, over a year.
Wait a second.
That is longer than Thriller. That is longer than Adele's 21.
Longer than Saturday Night Fever.
Rumors, all those. Yeah, this album was number one for 54 weeks. Here is America
What was
from
going
the
on? What
West
was going
Side
on
Story
in the
soundtrack.
country?
Okay, by me in America, everything free in America.
For a smoke me in America.
You got that song, Tonight, Maria. There's some bangers on
Now I
West Side
understand
Story.
why all of those songs are so lasting, because they were the album was number one for that long?
Over a year, West
Wait.
Side Story.
Hold on a second. What year was this? 61?
61.
Was nobody else recording for the entire year of 1961? This is not a knock on West Side Story. Brilliant play. The soundtrack is great. Amazing songs. But to be number one for a year?
I also remember back then, like pop and rock and R&B albums weren't really albums. It was more of a singles market. People released singles. It wasn't like,
I guess.
like what are the
Yeah,
great
that's true.
albums of like pop and rock and country and R&B artists of the early 60s? It was,
Yeah.
this is what people were buying albums
Right.
for, and they bought singles, which then you see like in the 60s, you do start seeing pop soundtracks, but it was, a lot of those were like for the Elvis movies or like when the Beatles did their movies, or
Right.
like the teen beach movies. They were kind of fluff,
Right.
a lot of it. Later in the 60s, you start seeing these really like serious movies, like thinking, what if we get pop artists to do a big song? That'll promote the movie.
Mm-hmm.
You get songs like this one from The Graduate, which gave us Simon
yeah.
Garfunkel's Mrs. Robinson.
And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will know.
I don't know if people now that know that song even know it's from a movie.
No, they don't.
And it's very much a part of the movie.
Yeah.
I mean, Mrs. Robinson is
Although,
the character in The
actually,
Graduate.
I will say people, if they actually know that song, they probably know them. Because I just don't think that's a song I don't think younger audiences know that song.
Probably
Mrs.
not.
Robinson, and they certainly don't know what it's about. If they
Like, who is Joe DiMaggio? What is...
who is this Mrs. Robinson?
Right,
Well,
and you
gotta
had-
see the movie.
Around that same time, Midnight Cowboy had a great soundtrack with Everybody's Talking by Harry Nilsson. It's a great song.
But even those were like,
It was like one or two songs on
Right,
the
I
score soundtrack. And you
right.
still saw a lot of, even through the 70s, the Rocky soundtrack, John Williams with Jaws and Close Encounters and Star Wars, it was still a lot of score.
Right.
And then one album kind of changed everything, and it became the era that lasted about 15 years of the giant mega pop blockbuster soundtrack album.
Thank you,
where the
Robert
music
Stigwood.
is part of it. Yes, Robert Stigwood, producer of Saturday Night Fever, which gave us the soundtrack, which gave us this all-time great jam.
Feel the city breaking and everybody shaking and we're staying alive, staying alive. Staying alive, staying alive.
So I just want to let everyone know, I don't always know what song Eric is going to play. I know we have an outline and I know what we're going to cover. I knew we were going to do Saturday Night Fever. So when you just
I
said,
tried to trick you.
when you said gave us this all-time jam, I honestly, like 4 different songs popped in my head because you could have picked anyone.
I
off that.
debated. I was like, oh, I really want to do Night Fever because I love Night Fever. But Staying Alive is Staying Alive. It's the
Jive
song
Talkin', Jive
when they
Talkin'.
when they
Anyone
made
for
this.
Jive Talking.
Well, that was not from the soundtrack.
I know it wasn't
It's
originally.
on the
it's
soundtrack.
on it. Yeah.
So that was sort of the thing. It was Saturday Night Fever is weird because it was a double album that had a lot of just disco hits that had been out in the last couple of years. The Bee Gees had some of their previous hits on it, and it had all the new songs. And then some of the old songs that were put on the soundtrack actually became hits because of it, like Disco Inferno by the Tramps or Boogie
Right.
Shoes, Casey and the Sunshine Band. Those songs had already kind of stalled a bit. And then the movie, because the movie was a pop culture phenomenon. Saturday Night Fever, in addition to being number 1 for 24 weeks, for a time was the best-selling album in history.
Right.
Before
Until
Thriller came out.
Thriller,
Yeah, it was. And the thread here we're going to see these giant soundtracks blow up is John Travolta.
Yeah, that's true. For a while, it was John Travolta.
There were 3...
I think we got, like, I know I gave him a little shout out going into the clip, but we should say, like, Robert Stigwood was the guy who realized that you could, because he was had been managing music acts and then decides he's going to get into film, but realized why not pair these things together
Right.
and make it even bigger. So,
Because the Bee Gees were on his RSO record label.
Right.
And he told them, he's like, you're making songs for this, and the song has to be called Night Fever. And they were like, that sounds like a porn. They did not want to do it.
right, they didn't want to do
They
it.
were not interested in it, but,
It
Bee
worked
Gees
out.
Rose
Worked
to the
out for
challenge.
everybody,
Yeah.
unless, of course, you hate disco, then it didn't work out for you at all.
Well, you suck. But so, yeah, John Travolta has the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. The next big blockbuster soundtrack he was on in 78 was the Grease soundtrack, which he was actually an artist on. Got a number 1 hit with You're the One That I Want.
Yep.
That's a massive album.
I played the
years-
hell out of that one that summer.
The Grease soundtrack?
Yeah, that was one of those, during the summer, someone brings out the boombox, you pop in the tape, and they just play the whole thing. Yeah,
Were you trying to hit the falsetto on Summer Nights?
Over there, Wild in the corner just laughing. He's like, I see Charles running around singing Summer Nights.
Yeah. But
yeah,
you,
it happened. Yeah, it happened.
you
We all
did the falsetto part?
I'm not saying which part I did, all right? I just know I sang a lot.
Do it.
I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it.
And this was also Robert Stigwood. Barry Gibb wrote the theme from Grease, so
Right.
they were involved again. In 1980, Stigwood figures, well the movie companies figured, what if we do for country music what Saturday Night Fever did for disco? And it's the exact same thing.
John Travolta.
Saturday Night Fever, that movie happened because of an article. It was an article in the New Yorker,
And
I
then
think.
New Yorker, or yeah, I think it was New Yorker.
It was an
About-
article
about,
about people going to clubs. They adapted the article into this movie. So this guy saw an article about Mickey Gilley's club in Texas.
Mhm.
I was like, what if we do the same thing again? And it happened. They got John Travolta in it.
And it freaking worked again.
Urban Cowboy. It was the country Saturday Night Fever, and it created a movement. We'll talk about that in a second.
If you
but
don't play
you know it's
No
what I'm
More
playing.
Looking for Love.
Of course.
All
it's
right.
Johnny Lee, here's Looking for Love.
I was looking for love in all the wrong places, looking for love in too many faces, searching your eyes.
So here's the weird thing about Urban Cowboy. I've watched the movie more times than I can honestly
Really?
count, and I really got into it, and even the soundtrack in, of all places, Jamaica. And the reason I
Okay.
watched it so many times is because I was staying at my uncle's house for the summer, and they had This was back in the age of VHS, and it was a big deal in Jamaica. They didn't have a lot of TV, and so you could go down and rent movies. That's how you could see American movies. And he rented Urban Cowboy for like 4 weeks in a row, and so I would just sit at home watching Urban Cowboy all day, and
Well,
so I
that
can pretty much sing every song on the soundtrack.
so that album produced 6 top 40 hits on the pop chart, 3 number ones on the country chart, and it created this country pop boom that was really big in the early 80s. Between disco and like when synth pop and Michael Jackson hit, you had people like Kenny Rogers and Ronnie Millsap and the Oak Ridge Boys just running the pop chart.
Right.
And then that kind of died out. But that was the Urban Cowboy boom. And it also, Western wear became really fashionable. Like tight Levi's killed
I didn't
bell
get
bottoms.
that deep into it.
No, but it was a cultural moment.
Yeah. No,
And then
definitely was.
even like disco, there was a backlash against it because country fans were like, we're tired of these city people wearing our clothes and singing Kenny Rogers songs. So in country music, you have something called the neo-traditionalist movement, which is George Strait and Randy Travis, and those guys inspired the generation after them. So Urban Cowboy has cast a 40-year-long shadow over country
Wow.
music, whether because people
Yeah,
wanted
either
to
you wanted
adopt
to do
it
it first, and then
or wanted to rebel against it.
Hmm.
But it shook things up and still kind of does
Yeah.
all these years later. But
But
But-
by the way, they got city folk back singing their songs now again,
of course, well, that's
Yeah.
the thing.
and now they've blended their sound with city folk sounds, and
You put a little pop, back then it was putting like a little bit of it, not a disco beat, but a little something you could dance to.
Right.
Now you put a little trap beat to it. It's all the same. History repeats. So after you had that Saturday Night Fever, Grease, Urban Cowboy, soundtracks became big business. And this is, I think, what you're talking about at the beginning. The 80s into the early 90s was this era of just massive blockbuster soundtrack albums. The movies became more about music, I think because of the sales of these records, also because you have MTV debuting. So
exactly.
so
yeah.
visuals and music are married in a new way. People are excited about. You see movies that are built around the soundtracks. It
Right.
feels like.
You could not have a blockbuster film without having. It's very rare to have a blockbuster film and not have a huge soundtrack
Right.
album.
In the mid to late 80s, you got the Flashdance soundtrack, Beverly Hills Cop, Top Gun gave us Danger Zone and Take My Breath
Right.
Away. Purple Rain, we are actually not going to talk too much about today.
We'll get to Purple Rain.
That's
then.
for
Yeah.
the next episode. But one of the big ones in '84, Footloose, Kenny Loggins.
Oh yeah.
Now I gotta cut loose, foot loose, kicked off the Sunday shoes. Please, Louise.
Now I knew you were going to go Footloose on that one,
You have
but
to.
again,
Let's Hear It for the Boys, my favorite.
let's hear it for the boy.
Almost Paradise, Ann Wilson from Heart and Mike Reno from Loverboy.
Chock full of great songs.
Shalimar, Dancing in the Sheets. But we had to do Kenny Loggins because Kenny Loggins was the king of soundtracks in the era of soundtracks.
Yeah.
He had hits from 5 different movies in the 80s. Caddyshack, Caddyshack 2, Top Gun, Footloose, and Over the Top, the Sylvester Stallone arm wrestling
Wait,
movie.
what song did he do in Over the Top?
It was Meet Me Halfway.
Oh, that was from Over the Top? I guess I would have known. I knew that at the time. but
Yeah.
I don't remember.
I mean,
it was that now.
Sylvester Stallone makes an arm wrestling movie, and there has to be a pop soundtrack to it.
By the way,
and of
that
course.
just made the title of that song very cheesy.
Meet Me Halfway.
I mean, it was kind of a cheesy ballad anyway, but in a arm wrestling, Meet Me Halfway. Oh my God.
No.
Okay.
And then a special shout out here to Bryan Adams, who people don't realize was the soundtrack king of the 90s.
That's right.
Everything I Do It For You was from Robin Hood. All for Love was from Three Musketeers. Have You Ever Really Loved a Woman from Don Juan DeMarco. That song from The Mirror Has Two Faces with Barbara Streisand.
I wonder
finally
if they
found someone.
consulted. I wonder if there was a meeting of the minds at some point where Bryan Adams said, "So tell me about how you got into this soundtrack thing."
Because you're making money off the movie.
Right. Yeah.
Worked for all of them. But so these were massive blockbusters. 87, you have another one where they marry the idea of the nostalgia, like boomer nostalgia, which was a new thing at that point. Let's take all these old 60s hits and let's put some new songs on it and make a movie about it. And then you get Dirty Dancing and you get this song, Bill Medley and Jennifer Warren's I've Had the Time of My Life. That sounds so 80s.
Yes.
Yet it was supposed to be in the 60s.
supposed to be a
Early
throwback.
60s?
It was a little bit of a throwback sound, but yes, very 80s gloss on top of it. By the way, we should say we because there were so many of them, but I'm just thinking about Bobby Brown, the Ghostbusters 2 soundtrack, and also the Ghostbusters soundtrack, which gave us Ghostbusters and all of that. But I was just thinking about
There's
this.
just so
I saw
many
Bobby Brown a
good
few weeks ago,
soundtracks.
and
Yeah, there's so many good songs. Just from the Dirty Dancing soundtrack, you had the new stuff, Hungry Eyes by Eric Carmen, Patrick Swayze, She's Like the Wind. And one of the old songs became a hit again. Do You Love
Do
Me by
you
the Contours.
love me?
Originally hit number 3 in the early 60s. In 88, got to number 11
Mhm.
because people were obsessed with Dirty Dancing. They made a sequel to the soundtrack.
They
Not
did?
even the movie at the time. They made a sequel to the movie. Like,
They just put out
15
another
years later,
song with
but
more
it
songs.
was like
and-
More Dirty Dancing or something like that. In the 90s, it kind of started to drop off. You started seeing a lot of the big pop star vehicles, kind of like what Purple Rain was, where you have not like the goofy Elvis movies, but you have a pop star trying to make a dramatic bid
Yes.
and be a serious artist, but also they still want to have the soundtrack. The biggest of those, and actually the biggest selling soundtrack of all time, you know what this is. From The
biggest sound-
Bodyguard, Whitney
Oh
Houston,
gosh, yes.
I Will Always Love You.
And I will always love you.
That never gets old, man.
It never
It
does.
Never gets old.
I've heard that 800 million bajillion times, and especially that point in the song, when
Right.
just that big hit comes in, it
I
just
always get
steamrolls
an-
right over you.
I used to get annoyed if you'd turn on the radio and you'd come on right after that and the song was ending. I'm like, damn, I missed it.
Yeah, there was no streaming. You couldn't just jump back to the beginning right there.
Yeah, the Bodyguard was definitely. It felt a little bit like the old, like the Saturday Night Fever, Urban Cowboy, Grease thing,
Right.
because it was just a vehicle for the star of the movie,
Yeah.
and wow,
And some other of those that
very
that's something
effectively.
that has
So
persisted.
that outsold Saturday Night Fever.
I think it's like 50 million worldwide at this
Huh.
point. It's the best-selling soundtrack in history.
Wow.
So it has surpassed Saturday Night Fever at this point. Some other ones, like when you think those the big pop star movie thing into the 2000s. We all know this one, Eminem from 8 Mile, Lose Yourself.
You better lose yourself in the music the moment you own it. You better never let it go. You only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow.
And even on
Oscar winner.
Oscar winner, and this next one is too, and it's funny because the movie itself was a remake, and the movie it remade also won an Oscar for Best Song, and this movie did too. Actually, this movie's been made 4 times. There's a version from
Yes.
the 30s,
Hmm.
from the 50s, one from the 70s with Barbra Streisand.
I always think that there's going to be another one before I die. There's going to be another version. of
100%
Star
there
is
will,
Born.
because they're always successful. It
Yeah.
always does well. So yeah, when Barbra Streisand and Chris Christopherson did A Star Is Born in the 70s, she had a song called Evergreen, went to number 1, won the Best Original Song Oscar. 2018, early 2019, Lady Gaga, Bradley Cooper, they do it, get a number 1 hit, win an Oscar for this song, Shallow.
In the shadow, we're far from the shallow now.
Fun fact, Bradley Cooper has more number 1 songs than Bruce Springsteen and James Brown and Journey and the Backstreet Boys combined.
That's not a fun fact, all right? That's a criminal fact, Eric. That is a criminal fact. Wow.
Yeah, just one. That's all you need to have more than all those artists.
That's just wrong.
But we're saying those big blockbuster pop albums kind of fell off in the 90s a bit. And part of the reason why, I think, is because of Disney. Because Little
Always
Mermaid,
Disney's fault.
89, you got Little Mermaid, and it's got Under the Sea and Kiss the Girl and all that kind of stuff. Those weren't like big pop hits, but the soundtrack was huge, and those songs everybody knows.
And
them.
everybody knows them.
Yeah, and then you've got Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin.
Oh, wait, there
there'd
was,
be like
there
one
was a
hit
big
song.
yeah, there was a hit off of Aladdin, right?
There'd be a hit off. Yeah, Aladdin had A Whole New World,
Whole New World, yeah.
and then but
I'm doing the magic carpet.
yeah, the tipping point I think for when Disney just fully assumed control of this was in 1994. Their biggest movie of their 90s classic animated films, the biggest soundtrack, and they got the biggest artist to do it. Elton John here is Can You Feel the Love Tonight from The Lion
Oh,
King.
I hate this song.
I
I'm
do
sorry.
too.
Can you feel the love tonight?
Not your favorite Elton John song?
Oh, I was so happy that he did not perform that song when I saw
Yeah,
him
he didn't do
at
it.
Dodger Stadium.
Yeah. Or Circle of Life. I mean, the most
Yeah.
probably enduring song from Lion King was not a hit song at the time, was Hakuna Matata.
Yeah.
I mean, that phrase just dug into
That's
pop
more
culture.
of a jam, if you ask
Right,
me.
right.
And in the same vein was the Phil Collins one from the Tarzan movie.
Ugh, You'll Be in My Heart.
Yes,
See, this is
both of them.
this-
And he
I hear the
someone
woo.
go, woo!
this is
No.
that song.
No,
That
no.
song is a battle line between like Gen X and millennials and Gen Z.
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh, Phil Collins, you'll be in my heart." I'm like, "No,
That is
no,
not what Phil Collins
in the
should
air
ever
tonight
be.
and against all odds and Cecilio
Right.
and there's This was like for us, it was like the neutered version of our favorite pop star.
Right,
Like, oh man, this guy used to be cool, and then make your money. I don't begrudge them that.
right, yeah.
But once those Disney movies kind of started to taper off a bit into the 2000s, Disney found a whole new way to dominate soundtracks and keep it going in the 2000s with the Disney Channel. And the original Disney Channel,
Oh, yeah.
their soundtracks, there was Hannah Montana, The Descendants, Camp Rock, Cheetah Girls, Lemonade Mouth. I know you were a big fan of that one.
Don't
but
know
the-
Lemonade
But
Mouth.
the granddaddy of all of these, the pop culture moment, it was music. It was something that just got kids so excited. High School Musical. Here's Zac Efron and Vanessa Hudgens singing Breaking Free.
We're breaking
We're
free.
soaring, flying. There's not a star in heaven that we can reach.
Look at all these kids bobbing their heads right now. They're like, oh, yeah, that's my jam. High School Musical was, I mean, it's still, it's been 20 years ago now almost.
Yeah.
And it's still, I just telling them, like, I love that they did a musical based on High School Musical. And then Disney made a TV show based on that. And there's a soundtrack from the TV show. And the name of all of it is High School Musical, the series, the soundtrack.
I think my head is about to explode. I really think it's going to explode.
Disney is
Sorry
brilliant.
for the mess.
They are brilliant at marketing all this kind of stuff. And Disney still runs soundtracks with all the Marvel movies. That's how
Yeah.
you get things like the Black Panther soundtrack that was all Kendrick Lamar curating it.
Yep.
You had Guardians of the Galaxy we talked about. They were still doing their big movies. The biggest Disney movie of the last 15, 20 years was Frozen. And there's a weird twist to this one. So there's 90s soundtracks. When there would be like the big pop hit from it, they would get some pop artist to sing it.
Right.
It wasn't the version that was featured in the movie. So you would have, the actors singing A Whole New World, but then you get Peebo Bryson and Regina Bell to sing
Right.
the single. You got Vanessa Williams doing Colors of the Wind. You get the pop star. That would be the hit. So when Disney did Frozen, they knew they wanted Let It Go to be the big song they were going to push. And Idina Menzel sings it. She had the huge hit with it. But Disney got Demi Lovato to sing it because they're like, well, she's the pop star. She'll have the hit. But the thing that happened was this was still the iTunes early streaming era. People who saw Frozen,
Everyone just went and...
they just want the version they heard in the movie. So Demi Lovato's version got
I
like,
had
number
no-
38 or something. It
Demi
didn't-
Lovato record...
They released it. They
Which version
pushed
are
it.
you about to play?
We're going to play the one that everybody knows.
Oh, all right.
And for any parent of any kid 15 or younger, I'm so sorry to put you through this. I'm sure this is traumatic for you because you've heard this so many times.
Hide your kids. You don't want to have them
Yeah.
singing it for the
And
rest.
I'm sorry to put this in your ears, but we have to. Idina Menzel, Let It Go.
Let it go, let it go. I am one with the wind and sky.
And then this was the Demi Lovato version.
Let it go, let it go. Can't hold it back anymore.
I can see
I'd
why
never heard the Demi Lovato
Disney
version.
thought,
I'd
well,
only-
radio's not going to play Idina Menzel. She's a Broadway star.
Yeah.
They're going to play Demi Lovato, who's a big pop star. No, because fans were like, I mean, they like Demi Lovato, but you want the version you heard in the movie.
Yeah.
And so now Disney doesn't even bother with that. A couple of years ago, and sorry, parents, I'm not going to play this one. I'll spare you this one. But when We Don't Talk About Bruno from Encanto went viral, that song went to number one.
Oh, yeah. I
there was
remember-
no pop star version.
I remember
of
one
it.
day in the office, you were like, said something about the number one song. I was like, how is that number one? And I had seen the
Yeah.
movie, and the song was like, I liked it as I was watching the movie, but that it went to number one.
And it wasn't even
That
the song they thought was going to be the one that caught on. There's other songs on that soundtrack they thought would be the big moment. We Don't Talk About Bruno was just sort of a goofy
Yeah.
moment in the movie, but it just caught on, went viral, shot to number one. So
The power of the mouse.
it is the power of the mouse, and they still kind of run it. But now we're seeing, with Twisters, that is like an old school. Just look at the country charts, get everybody on it to record a new song, and put that soundtrack out.
It's very 80s.
It
Very
is.
80s.
I love it.
Yeah.
But before we go, there's one we have not talked about.
There's one song that you have to play. There's
And
no
this-
way that you are doing soundtracks and you're not going to tip your hat, especially this week,
This week,
to the queen of all that is French Canadian. The queen of the
Olympics.
divas at the Olympics, Celine Dion. It was an amazing moment.
It was, before we play it, it was not just the song. Because the weird thing about the Titanic soundtrack is that it was all score music, and that was the only pop song on the record. But that album was number one for, I think, 16 weeks.
based
Because
on-
people loved
that
that
song.
song, and they loved the music, though.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to
because
be
they fell in love. The whole
the movie.
was such a.
I mean, everybody knows Titanic, knows it was a big thing. If you weren't around in late 97, early 98 when it was a thing, it's one of the most dominant pop culture things I've ever experienced in my life. It was like Titanic mania.
Yeah,
it was
it
weird.
really was.
Remember stories that girls would go watch it and would be so heartbroken about Leo, they would come home and take ice baths to experience what he felt? I was like, what is happening? Thank God for those girls there was no
No,
TikToks.
no,
They'd be
no.
ashamed if they were posting all that.
Oh my gosh.
But it was all
yeah.
summed up by this. We're all tired of hearing it, but it is a perfect
we not?
song, and let's not deny it.
Yeah.
Celine Dion, My Heart Will Go On.
And I know that my heart will go on.
I still love it. You know what?
It's
I'm not
very
going to
weird.
lie.
It's so attached to the, like, anytime I hear that, I can't hear that song without thinking about the movie, even though, like, it would be a fine enough song even without the movie.
Right.
But I think they were the perfect marriage, and
And
both made the other bigger.
And what helps with it, and why I think the soundtrack itself was so huge, because the song "My Heart Will Go On" obviously doesn't fit in the 1912 time period in the movie set.
Right.
It only plays over the ending credits. But the reason you picture the movie, not just because of her video, the melody of "My Heart Will Go On" is worked into all of the score music. So you'd hear like the little flutes and the little like
Oh yes, that's right. It
the
is. That's
basic
right,
the
yeah.
basic melody of
There's
the
sort
song.
of building to it.
Yeah, it weaves in and out of the soundtrack, so you just keep hearing it. And so by the time
Right.
in the movie, when the song comes up, you've already
Is
heard
that
it.
a flute they're playing or a recorder?
I don't know. There's probably
I'm
some.
gonna have to look up the instrumentation on
I
that.
think there's a flute on that. Who knows?
But it would be cool if it was a recorder.
Playing hot cross
I
buns.
bet you I can find that on YouTube. Somebody has definitely played that whole song on a recorder.
100,000 million billion percent yes.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for soundtracks. A very complete history of soundtracks and
Right.
pop music. Well done, Eric. And we will see you next time on Get to Look. Very, very special episode next time. Something that,
Close to both of our hearts.
yes,
Another soundtrack.
indeed. All right. We'll see you next time.